Part of the digestive process of a piece of lettuce, said lettuce needs to enter the mouth. In this case, the incisors, which are highlighted with the color cyan, take the first bite, taking off a small chunk of Roberto. The lips and tongue move together to bring Roberto further into the mouth. Roberto passes by the canines, which are highlighted in dark blue, and they are used to shred tough foods like red meats. Saliva begins to pour around Roberto, rendering Roberto to become a sloppy, wet mass of food. The saliva is full of enzymes called salivary amylase, which breaks down the fiber Roberto has in him. Before he's even realized what's happened, he's arrived before the final boss, the molars. They're a set of molars and premolars. They're usually part of the final stages of the chewing process, and they're used to crush and grind food. Roberto suffers immensely from the molars and premolars, flattening poor Roberto into nothing more than a couple of scraps. Due to the saliva around him acting like a net, he becomes a bolus, a bald piece of food. Roberto manages to barely leave the mouth with his life intact, and comes across a fork in the road. This is the pharynx, a common passageway used by food items like him, or beverages or air. He begins to feel the ground, or rather, muscles, start to move below him as he is thrown into the abyss. Roberto is now in the esophagus. As he looks for a way to escape, the walls above him close, pushing him further into the esophagus. This is called peristalsis. He reaches an entryway and falls into a pool of acid. This door is called the lower esophageal sphincter, and it's used to keep the acid from entering the esophagus. The door also happens to have a friend called the cardiac, the smallest part of the stomach that secretes mucus used to protect the esophagus alongside the sphincter, keeping it safe from the hidden dangers that lie in the stomach. Roberto has now officially entered the body of the stomach. He's mixed together with secretions, one being pepsin. The pepsin begins to break down what little protein Roberto has in him, and is brought into the waiting room, the fundus, waiting along with other foods until it's his time. When his turn comes, he's mixed with gastric fluids and becomes chyme. He is then pushed into the pyloric part of the stomach. The pylorus is the gatekeeper to the small intestine, whereas the pyloric sphincter is the gate itself, letting in only small bits of food. After obtaining the all clear, he is allowed to pass into the duodenum. In another organ called the pancreas, trypsinogen, along with its friend chymotrypsinogen, is created and released into the duodenum. After having a quick talk with enterokinase that's present in the intestine, they begin to furthermore break down Roberto's protein defenses, continuing what had started in the stomach.
Pancreatic enzymes such as lipase and amylase don't have a role in the lettuce breakdown due to the lack of starches and fats. The liver, which usually secretes bile, is also not active in Roberto's journey as Roberto is fatless. This results in the gallbladder not being active as its job is to store bile. Food continues to move through the small intestine by segmentation, the act of churning Roberto with intestinal secretions, as an abrupt bend means Roberto has now entered the jejunum, the second section of the small intestine. Most of the chemical digestion and nutrient absorption is occurred here. Finally, Roberto enters the ileum, the last section of his adventure through the small intestine, as he faces more enzymes. Peptidase, sucrase, lactase, and maltase all step forward. Roberto laughs as he knows most of these enzymes are harmless. Maltase, sucrase, and lactase all break down disaccharides, starches which Roberto doesn't have. Roberto, however, further is broken down by peptidase, breaking his dipeptides into amino acids. Afterwards, Roberto enters the large intestine, the huge reabsorption machine. As Roberto is welcomed in, he is greeted by the cecum, which compacts Roberto's remains. Roberto relaxes and meets the appendix, whom is attached to the cecum. It doesn't play a role in digestion, but it is a marvelous tourist attraction for passing foods. Roberto says his goodbyes and enters the ascending colon tract, which he travels through for a bit until the colon bends sharply to the left and he enters the transverse colon. Once again, Roberto rides through the tract before swiftly making a 90-degree left turn as peristaltic contractions continue to push him through the large intestine and is tossed into the descending colon. Roberto, sick to his stomach, is forced to ride through the descending tract before the tract curves and he enters the sigmoid colon. Finally, Roberto thinks as the slow, almost relaxing ride from the S-shaped sigmoid colon leads Roberto to the rectum. Usually the rectum can store waste, but Roberto is desperate to leave and prepares just for that. The smooth circular muscle around the anus forms the internal anal sphincter, which are involuntarily controlled. The external anal sphincter guards the anus and has a ring of skeletal muscle fibers that surround the anal cavity. Roberto positions himself and feels a sense of relief as he is pushed out of the anus to start a new journey.